咁喺高水平嘅運動入邊，最難咧從來唔係設計復健嘅計劃，而係判斷運動員到底準備好未。咁風險好高，時間都好趕，咁幾乎咧係冇犯錯嘅空間嘅。咁今日呢一集咧，佢邀請到嘅係 Jason Tuori， 佢係一位運動嘅物理治療師，咁長期專注喺復健啊、運動表現同埋回場決策嘅交界。
佢目前喺 Brooklyn Nets 嘅 G Team Long Island Nets 入邊擔任一個表現協調員同埋物理治療師，
主要係負責高水平嘅籃球運動員復健同埋回場嘅判斷。咁同時佢嘅背景都涵蓋咗表現導向嘅治療啦、跑步相關嘅訓練，以及透過 PT Inquest 推廣力量嘅測試 Force Testing 同埋等速肌力測試 Dynamometry 嘅教育。但我覺得 Jason 最特別嘅地方係佢講嘅唔係淨係令運動員變強，而係點樣去做出更加好嘅決策。咁喺一個運動員睇落去好似好好，感覺都好好，但係其實仲未準備好嘅世界入邊咧，咁佢嘅工作咧就啱啱好就係呢一個關鍵嘅位置，咁就係數據、臨床判斷同埋信任之間啦。咁今日呢一集我哋會傾到力量測試、客觀化嘅復健，同埋一個更加核心嘅問題。咁究竟咩時候一個運動員先算係真係準備好翻返去球場上面呢？咁等我哋歡迎 Jason。Jason， 我哋由一個好常見嘅迷思開始先。咁好多人會覺得咧，翻到去球場上面就等於唔痛啦，力量翻嚟就可以啦。咁但係點解咁樣嘅諗法其實唔係太完整呢？咁喺高強度嘅運動入邊，翻返球場呢件事真正困難嘅地方喺邊度呢？
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the root of it in my mind comes down to how we view testing as a whole. So when we think about our return to sport or return to play testing, we're probably thinking about it backwards. Traditionally, we think this individual passes this test, therefore they are ready to go on, and that means that they're ready to return to sport or they're ready to return to jump. But that's not actually what our testing tells us. Our testing is more designed to screen out those who don't do well in the test, actually, and to say, an example would be if somebody is on an isokinetic test after ACL reconstruction, and we've set some threshold like you need to hit 66% limb symmetry index in order to start running, and they hit 50%, that tells me a lot more actually that they are not ready to run. So a failed test tells us, it gives us a pretty good amount of confidence that the person's not ready to move on to the more complex thing. But if somebody does pass it, there's still a chance that it's not going to go well when they move on to the next step. So I think that's why it's so challenging, because the only test we have to determine if someone's ready to return to sport is if they play the sport. Except that can't be the test, right?
Yeah. 咁有好多臨床或者教練都會講，希望令判斷更加客觀，咁所以會用啲力量測試 Force Testing， 甚至啲等速肌力嘅測試 Dynamometry 呢種工具。咁但係如果由基本嚟睇，你覺得呢啲測試真正解決到係啲咩問題？咁佢哋可以幫我哋睇到啲乜嘢？可能用我哋平時肉眼睇嘅，其實唔係好睇得出嚟嘅咧。
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we probably can separate it into just the fundamental biomechanics side of, we have kinematics, which are joint angles and kind of watching somebody move, and then we have kinetics, which are the forces at play. We can see kinematics, we can measure kinematics, and we've done that for a very long time, both with goniometers and with different types of motion capture. But it's been very hard to measure kinetics, or the forces at play. So we've really just had to make a lot of inferences and assumptions about forces just based on movement positions, or maybe based on exercises or outputs. That's where dynamometers are very helpful, because at its core, if we're doing an isometric test, let's go back to the knee for an example, or the hip. Let's use the hip, actually, because everybody uses the knee. So we're using the hip, and we're going to measure somebody's peak hip adduction output. Well, we might be able to pick up on some force deficits in isolation that we didn't know that individual had, because we were watching them move, in a multi-joint, multiplanar movement, and they look generally fine. But when we isolate them, they still have this inability to produce force. And that just comes down to the first order impairments that we learned about when we were in school, right? Like restore range of motion, restore strength at the local level before you progress to the more complex level. That's kind of how I see it.
咁我覺得有一種情況係好的，咁就係有啲運動員咧睇落去動作好順暢啦，表現都開始唔錯啦，咁甚至佢對自己都好有信心，但係測出嚟嘅力量嘅數據咧都仲係未得嘅。咁你有冇遇過呢一種運動員？咁我哋應該要點樣去看待呢啲睇落去已經好返呢件事咧
I do. I actually see it pretty frequently, as most people who work with really high level athletes, they know that those athletes are very good at overcompensating. And that kind of goes back again why like our eyes are maybe not the most sensitive measures to be able to detect some of these things. We have the individual who in isolation, if we kind of corner them and they have no other ways to cheat, that's where we can see that isolated capacity deficit. But as soon as they have an affordance to move a certain way and offload a certain way, it actually they look like they're performing fine. It's just that they're not actually moving the same way. And, an example of this that I can give is an individual who has turf toe. This is a pretty common one. If somebody has turf toe or a plantar plate tear under the first MTP, they do everything they can to try to offload the medial side of their foot during complex movement. And they, if we kind of take them into isolation and measure the capacity or the first MTP flexion strength, we'll see that they have force output deficits still, whether that's painful or non-painful. And then they go move and they're on the basketball court and they look phenomenal. And it's really because in that way, we can't tell the fact that they're loading the lateral side of their foot more. They look like they're doing fine. They're just overcompensating very well.
咁調翻轉啦，你有冇遇過呢種力量測試嘅數據睇落去都好好，咁但係整體感覺你係覺得佢仲係未準備好嘅？咁你點樣睇數據同埋臨床判斷之間嗰條界線呢？咁咩時候應該要相信數據？咁咩時候要相信你自己嘅經驗同埋直覺呢？
Yeah, this is the one that's really challenging because when you kind of look at the data and you're like, well, based on all of these tests, I can't say that they failed anything. I just don't know entirely that they are ready for that final step. And I think some of that does go back to that first concept I talked about, which is we have these sets of tests that tell us with pretty good levels of confidence, if you fail them, you're not ready. But if you pass them, I don't know that you're ready yet because maybe there was just another test that wasn't part of my battery that would have been the thing to expose what was the rate limiter. And we talk about psychological readiness, and that could be one of those tests. But I think one of the fallacies that we're starting to get into now in this modern era where we have clinical technology is the assumption that now that we have technology, we have everything figured out. and I don't think that that's the case. I think we certainly have a few more things figured out than we used to have, but there are still other things that aren't part of our testing batteries right now that probably would show some deficits. We just don't know what those tests or those measures are yet. And, I think the holy grail that we're all thinking about is now that we have wearable devices in sport that track acceleration, whole body acceleration and GPS, think about for soccer or for basketball, we know how many miles or meters somebody is running per game at high speeds. We can see accelerations and decelerations, but right now we're limited to the idea that it's just whole body movement and not joint specific output. So that's just an example. Like if we had some wearable devices that told us, hey, when somebody is running and cutting at this speed, they still have a knee extensor output deficit. Well, geez, that's probably the test right there, but we don't have that clinical technology yet. So here we are, just thinking everyone's good to go once they pass our tests in the house. It's definitely really challenging still.
咁實務上你哋係通常係點樣去確認佢可以翻返去球場？會唔會真係俾佢翻去球場試下先，睇佢嘅表現同埋感覺係點樣？
Yeah, and I think that is the essential thing is that we don't wait to get somebody, in my setting basketball, we don't wait to get somebody back on the court for the first time once they've passed every single test that we have. And that's kind of the nice thing about having a structured battery along the course of rehab is we have checkpoints that say, once you're here, that means you can start to do these things. Once you're here, you can start to do these things. And it kind of just is based off of a sensible biomechanical progression. For example, if somebody is coming back from a soleus strain and we're measuring their peak soleus force and comparing that to the other side, or we're normalizing that to, torque to their body weight. And we see that they're starting to get into this range of 70 to 80% symmetry compared to the other side. typically that's when it may be comfortable for them to start doing some easy running, and so we have them start running. And if that goes well, then we know that test ended up passing them, at least to some volume and intensity. But we also know that they're not ready to sprint yet, because there is a higher level of force output that needs to happen in order for that to still be something that's okay. So we probably use some of these isometric or isokinetic or force plate based tests as kind of checkpoint monitoring tools. And then we continue to expand what they're able to do on the court. Like, this is the total time, this is the intensity of each of these actions that you can take. And then we need to assess your symptoms before and after. I would say that's pretty much how I go about things.
仲有你哋係點樣同教練或者體能教練合作？例如喺唔同嘅階段會唔會有啲檢查嘅點啊？之後會再同佢一齊討論佢嘅訓練量，佢可以承受嘅負荷。咁大概嘅流程係點樣呢？
Yeah, and I would say a pretty typical high performance unit is you have someone on the medical side. You may have both an athletic trainer and a physical therapist on the medical side. You have a strength coach on the performance side. You may have a sports scientist who's kind of bridging a couple of those things together and monitoring some of those metrics. And then essentially, and one of the most important in my mind, is you have a skills coach that you can work with on the court, because everyone else that I just listed is not technically the expert in getting somebody on the basketball court and having them go through drills. We can, we're probably, we're pretty capable when it comes to non-sport skill related things like, hey, I need you to sprint up to this speed. I need you to cut 90 degrees. But when it comes to integrating that into the basketball skills specific side, it's great to have a skills coach with you. And you basically just outline and say, hey, I need this guy to be able to do some 75% effort decelerations, like design any drills that you want that are going to get him into that, so that it kind of checks two boxes. There's the physical side that we need to load, and then there's the skill reacquisition side of them kind of dusting off the rust from not playing for a while. And yeah, I would say constant communication. There's different settings are going to have different levels of overlap between those jobs, and maybe some settings only have a couple of those individuals that I listed. So everyone kind of needs to know what their domain and role is, and just not have an ego,
咁而家好似等速肌力測試 dynamometry 或者各種力量測試就越嚟越多人用啦。咁但係覺得有用呢啲工具同埋用得好，其實一定係差好遠嘅。咁你觀察到最常見嘅錯誤係乜嘢啊？
Yeah, I would say the single biggest mistake is assuming that the data that you just collected is valid. And that's the biggest thing, is just because the device said the number doesn't mean that the test was performed in a valid way. And that's really dangerous, because if we collect inaccurate data and then make decisions based off of inaccurate data, then we go to some places that we don't want to go. That's why that's probably my biggest emphasis when I'm teaching someone on dynamometry and force testing is like, well, number one, we can't even have any conversations about data inference and interventions of what to do with this stuff if we don't know that it's reliable and valid data in the first place. So do your testing well, and at least you know that what you got is true. And so that's kind of the thing, is just because they exist doesn't mean they're being used well, as you alluded to.
咁你可唔可以分享一啲例子啊？
Yeah, a good one would be our verbal cueing. So if we're doing an isometric peak force or peak torque test, we want our verbal cueing to be emphasizing really slow, gradual building up to a peak. And if we tell somebody, I want you to explode fast or kick as fast and as hard as possible, and we start to use words that involve, time or time constraints, then what we typically see is that the test has a very high coefficient of variation or poor repeatability. And that's because the peak that we got out of somebody kicking really fast probably doesn't represent their true muscular force output. It's probably more of like a rate of force development type test instead of a peak force test. And while rate of force development is an important concept, it's just very, very noisy, and it can't be measured very well. And so the verbal cueing that we use alone as part of our setup, that can dictate the entire test, as well as some other setup variables, like making sure that you're testing at the angle that you intend to test at, and calculating torque and things like that.
咁好多嘅跟學訓練咧都係業餘運動員，佢哋有工作啦，同時都有運動嘅。咁但係通常咧都係缺乏啲系統性嘅重量訓練，所以佢哋都經常受傷。咁有啲人有開過刀啦，有啲人又冇開。咁但係好多復健通常佢哋就係做到佢日常功能嘅功能冇問題啦。咁但係仲係未可以去到可以應付到比賽嘅強度。咁因為可能預算或者資源嘅問題啦，咁佢哋都會嚟揾翻個體能教練或者係私人教練嘅。咁但係其實我哋就一定冇你哋咁完整嘅團隊啦，亦都冇啲咁高級嘅設備可以做力量測試。咁所以我都好好奇，咁喺呢種情況下面，你哋會建議體能教練可以用啲咩比較簡單或者有效嘅測試方法去判斷一個人可唔可以翻返球場上面？咁同埋有啲咩指標係你覺得會特別關鍵嘅咧？
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's.I would say not even specific to where you're practicing, but everybody is looking for low burden, what's affordable, low resource acquisition. If you'd asked me that 5 years ago, it would be probably a more difficult question. Now, the nice thing about how much clinically accessible technology there is that because there are more companies, the actual prices of some of these devices have gone to very accessible levels. I mean, you can get a very reliable 500 kilogram load cell for $220, which in the gym sense is like, yeah, it's actually pretty good relative to a lot of other stuff we spend money on in the gym. So I'm always an advocate for, hey, start with the thing that's least expensive, has an easy user interface, ideally is quick to set up and low burden just from a resource standpoint. We do have tension cell dynamometers. You can get those in the $200 to $300 US dollar range. And if you go even cheaper than that, technically you can use things like crane scales that are like $30 to $40 weight-based scales. Someone would just use at a market. So you can get creative with things like that. I would say even outside of the actual clinical technology side, that's when you just need to use your knowledge of biomechanics to create exercises that become the test. And that may be even just using a leg extension machine and using a repetition max based off of a leg extension machine if it's somebody with a knee injury, or if we think that somebody who has an isolated joint related issue, test that with an exercise that really constrains them and forces them to have to use that area. If you don't have a leg extension machine and it's a knee, you can use some sort of split squat or body constrained squat to make sure that their center mass is coming forward. They're using their knee extensors. So using those principles, like sometimes the exercise can become the test in itself, and then progressing the chaotic nature of that. So if you're good at slow and heavy, are you the same competency level compared to the other side at fast and explosive? Which could represent something like a vertical jump or a broad jump. Now, broad jumps have always been the cheapest way because we put tape on the ground and we see how far somebody can jump. So that part's pretty easy. Vertical jump can show us some things too. And there are other, there are of course other ways that are a little bit cheaper than getting force plates to assess someone's vertical jump. We get different measures out of force plates, but if jump height is the proxy output that somebody is looking for, then we can do things as low tech as measuring their standing reach and then having them jump and hit a target on the wall and measuring the jump height. So it is, you can probably scale it down to as low budget as you need or as high budget as you need. The high budget does things like make your life a little bit easier. The low budget is a little easier on the pocket. So yeah, it's definitely doable. There are probably some things that are maybe not to the degree of accuracy that they could be if you're on the low budget side. But if it comes down to either not doing it or doing that, then yeah, it's definitely superior to not doing anything.
咁我自己去帶運動員嘅時候呢，咁我覺得有一個好大嘅問題就係佢哋究竟敢唔敢相信自己嘅身體，尤其是喺冇咁多客觀嘅數據下面呢，咁佢好容易用感覺去判斷自己準備好未。咁但係呢，佢哋啲痛又時不時會出現。咁你會點樣看待呢件事呢？咁我翻返球場呢樣嘢有幾多其實係幫佢哋建立信心啦，降低佢哋唔確定嘅感覺，而唔係淨係令力量變得更加強。
Yeah, I would say conceptually it's very important. But I think it's a one-way street. And how I would describe that is basically, if somebody is really confident but really weak, then I don't think the confidence is the thing that's going to keep them safe. If they're really confident and they're really strong, I feel better about that. Now, the inverse side is they're not confident and they are strong. That's a different conversation for sure, because then it's like, well, we need to show this person that you are actually better than you think you are. We need to improve your confidence by showing that you can get some small wins along the way. And those are typically the individuals who are very strong, but they just haven't gotten the repetitions of the thing back yet. And once they get enough repetitions, they start to reduce some of that fear avoidance behavior. And then you have the most common group that I see, which are not confident and not strong. And that's a problem. And it's a problem in particular because I think if we aren't measuring strength, then we don't know if that person is not confident and strong or not confident and not strong. And those end up being two different interventions, right? One of them is, well, psychological intervention, graded exposure, and now you're good. But if we try to use a psychological intervention and graded exposure to the person who doesn't have the underlying capacity, then we just did two things. Number one, we kind of gaslit them, which is not a good thing to do to people. And number two, we probably end up putting them in a situation that they are not physically ready for, but we convinced them that they were. And so that's why I think it's really important. And, you know, the term kinesiophobia is used a lot for this when somebody's afraid of movement or afraid of a certain movement. But note that phobia is by definition an irrational fear. So kinesiophobia would be an irrational fear of some movement. But if somebody still has a physical deficit, that is by definition not an irrational fear. That's a very rational fear because their body's not ready for it. So I think that's kind of just one of those things where, does confidence matter? Absolutely. People do need to be confident, but they need to be confident in context and in the right context. That is, once they have passed those physical things and, you know, the joint has settled down, it's gotten back to normal, then that the physiological ability is going to help probably breed some of that psychological confidence anyway. And so, yeah, I do think it's important in that way.
咁如果今日有一個運動員已經通過晒所有嘅測試，你會點樣去幫助佢更加有信心啲呢？
Yeah, I think it does just need to be like, if they've passed all of my testing, at that point, my last test is, can you play and can you feel free on the court? Can you look the way that you normally look? Can you attack and be as aggressive as you normally are? And that in itself kind of becomes the test. And so you do probably see a lot of those where like they pass these somewhat sterile tests, like jumping on a force plate or doing, closed clinic environment things. But then they just need a certain number of repetitions back on the court before they look like themselves again. And that's why we almost never clear someone on the medical side and then have them return to competition immediately. It's like, if they've passed all my tests, I want to see how they hold up with 2 weeks at a minimum of scrimmaging. And this is maybe in the case of a long-term rehab where they've been out for multiple months. I want to see that you can practice and scrimmage for 2 weeks before you get into full competition, because we know certainly that the difference between scrimmaging your teammates and full competition of people that are not your teammates, the intensity gets higher than that. So we can't even replicate game intensity really. But they do need to get, I think they just need repetitions. Once they have built the capacity, their brain just needs to rebuild those pathways and regain that confidence and see that with X number of repetitions, I've done this and it's been successful. And therefore it continues to build this confidence of like, well, yeah, I did that 34 times and it was successful. So it's probably going to be successful on the 35th time.
咁調翻轉啦，其實如果有啲人未去到個標準，但係佢又好有信心，好想翻返球場上面，咁通常呢樣嘢喺業餘嘅運動員都好常見嘅。你會點樣建議教練去處理呢啲情況呢？
It's a tough one, definitely, because it's never a happy conversation to have to slow somebody down, right? What I do is basically I break it down and I explain to them, hey, this was the test that you have not passed yet. And let me put it into these terms. So let's say you didn't pass this isolated strength test. And so I'll say, okay, today I put you in the best possible position to succeed. You know, we're inside the clinic. No one else is watching. It's quiet. You know, it's a comfortable temperature in here. And despite you being confident in this, like going into this test, you still didn't pass it. How do you think you're going to do when we add extra layers of chaos? Like now people are flying at you. You're no longer thinking about, can my knee generate force? Can my hip generate force? Your body's going to try to do something to evade a defender, or you're going to move in ways that you aren't really thinking about your body. The problem is if you don't have the capacity to withstand those forces, which I don't think you do based on you not passing this strength test, then we might get into a bad position here. And I'm not saying that that's going to be an immediate re-injury, but maybe that's something where it kind of leads to an overuse injury of something else too. So, you know, it's like, if you can't do this in the simple way, why would we think that you would be able to be successful in the complex way? So we just need to kind of, we're going to get there, but we just need to give it more time to cook. And in particular, when it's somebody who's in long-term rehab and they start to get impatient towards the end, I remind them that they've done such a good job being patient up to this point. Why would you rush the end, you know?
最後啦，我就想問，如果今日你淨可以留低一個重要嘅原則，係俾高壓或者唔係好確定嘅情況下面去做翻回場嘅決策嘅教練或者治療師，你會講啲乜嘢呢？
I would say start with first principles. So really, that's where I go back to. If I could test, if I only could test one thing, it would be some sort of isolated joint force capacity. If it's anterior knee issues, I'm testing quadriceps knee extension. If it's an ankle issue, largely like a calf posterior ankle issue, I'm testing someone's calf strength. If it's the hip, I'm testing adduction and abduction. So look at the thing in isolation before you move on to these higher level jumps, hops, cuts, change of direction tests, sprinting, because somebody can, like we said, if it's a movement test, somebody can look pretty normal. They can pass a movement test, but it's really, really hard to cheat a test that's isolated and constrained and is supposed to expose some sort of force output. So that's that is first principle. I know that because dynamometry and force testing is relatively expanded new clinical technology. It's not really new because dynamometers have existed for a while, but it's new to a lot of clinics because now they're accessible. They appear to be a new shiny tool, but this is an original principle. This is just a new solution to an old problem. So go back to your first principles. Have they done the basic thing well before progressing on to the really complex thing? I think if we go in that direction, then we're going to have more hits than misses.
Got it. Thank you for some amazing advice. Thank you so much to be here. It's good to be on the show. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for having me, Jason.
喺我哋結束之前，如果你想更加深入了解 Jason 嘅內容，或者想追蹤佢嘅課程，包括好似 Dungeons and Dynamometry 呢種專係講力量測試同埋回場判斷嘅課程，我會將佢嘅 Instagram 同埋相關連結擺喺我哋 description 度。咁我覺得今日呢一集咧最值得帶走嘅一件事就係翻去球場咧，從來都唔係淨係單一嘅標準嘅決定。咁當然數據好重要，力量都好重要。咁但係真正困難嘅係你要點樣將呢啲數據、動作嘅品質、運動嘅表現同埋一個運動員嘅心理狀態全部整合埋一齊，做出一個啱嘅決定。咁好多嘅時候咧，一個人可以測試過關啦，動作都可以做到出嚟嘅。咁但係只要有任何一個環節仲未準備好嘅話，咁佢喺球場上面嘅風險咧都仲喺度嘅。所以翻返球場呢件事，本質上面唔係揾合格，而係要降低不確定性。你唔係喺度問佢可唔可以上場，你係喺度問喺依家呢個狀態下面上場嘅風險我接唔接受到。所以如果你今日係一個運動員或者一個教練，或者你正喺度帶緊一個復健緊嘅個案，我希望你記咗一件事，唔好淨係問時間夠未，而係開始問呢個人係咪真係準備好。咁如果呢一集對你有幫助，記得分享俾你嘅隊友、教練或者任何一位喺復健路上嘅人，亦都唔好唔記得訂閱我哋呢個 channel， 然後喺留言區話俾我聽今日邊一個觀念最打破你原本嘅認知。咁我哋繼續 move without limits。我係 Jason， 我哋下次見。